Have you ever stopped to imagine what happened behind the thick walls of a Casa-Grande during the period of slavery? While many history books describe these mansions as symbols of power, wealth, and the authority of the plantation masters, very rarely is it revealed what was truly hidden behind their closed windows and heavy doors. Beyond the senzala, where suffering was visible, there was a silent and cruel prison inside the Casa-Grande itself. A prison without bars, without visible cells, but inescapable nonetheless. The prison destined for enslaved women. These women were not only forced into exhausting labor in the mills, fields, and senzalas. Many of them lived under the constant terror of the nighttime summons, known as the torment of the night. At any moment, the overseer or the plantation master could choose one of them and drag her from the senzala into the torch-lit corridors, leading her to the so-called forbidden room. There, between walls that bore witness to dark secrets, these women were violated, silenced, and turned into prisoners of desire and brutality. But the prison of the Casa-Grande was not limited to physical violence. It was also a psychological jail where fear, silence, and helplessness became invisible chains. Every step taken by an enslaved woman toward that room was accompanied by looks of pain, compassion, and restrained revolt. Mothers prayed that their daughters would not be the next. Husbands wept in silence, and children learned far too early what it meant to live under the yoke of oppression. In this video, you will discover how the Casa-Grande, a symbol of luxury and authority, also functioned as a secret prison. You will learn stories of pain, but also of female resistance, which became seeds of freedom. Because understanding this past is not just about revisiting history, it is about opening our eyes to see how many invisible chains still remain bound to the present. And to begin this journey, we must first understand what the Casa-Grande represented within the slave system. The Casa-Grande was much more than a colonial mansion built amid vast sugarcane plantations. For the slave-holding society, it represented the heart of the plantation masters' economic, political, and social power. Built in a strategic position, almost always on the highest point of the estate, it dominated the landscape like a beacon of authority and surveillance. From its windows, the master could see the senzala, the pillory, the sugarcane fields, and the yard where the enslaved people worked. Every stone laid in those walls carried the weight of domination, and every reinforced door symbolized the insurmountable distance between those who commanded and those who obeyed. While the senzala sheltered exhausted bodies marked by shackles and whips, the Casa-Grande displayed the glow of imported porcelain, carved furniture, and silver chandeliers. It was there that parties, banquets, and political meetings were held, deciding not only the future of the estate, but also the fate of hundreds of enslaved people. However, the contrast between luxury and pain was not limited to material aspects. The Casa-Grande worked as an essential mechanism of surveillance and control. From its balconies, the overseer monitored discipline, and under his orders, punishments were carried out at the whipping post or the pillory. The plantation master was seen as an almost untouchable figure, a patriarch whose power extended far beyond the cultivated land. His dominance was not only economic, but also spiritual and social. Often he determined the religious life of the enslaved, imposing Catholic practices while repressing African traditions. He decided marriages, separated families, and enforced punishments. The overseer, the right arm of this power, maintained order through force, using the whip as an instrument of discipline. Shackles and iron chains were the tools that sustained the hierarchy. In this context, the Casa-Grande became a place with two faces. On the outside, it was the showcase of prosperity. On the inside, a space of constant tension. Its wide corridors, sitting rooms, and luxurious chambers hid secrets that official history tried to erase. There, a logic of power was consolidated in which every enslaved woman was seen as an object, every enslaved man as disposable labor, and every enslaved child as potential future profit. The imposing architecture was not just an aesthetic detail, but a tool of intimidation. Every time an enslaved person raised their eyes to those walls, they were reminded of their condition of subordination. The pillory, erected right in front of the Casa-Grande, completed the scene of terror. There, before everyone's eyes, punishment became a spectacle. The whip-tearing skin, the wooden stocks binding arms and legs, the screams echoing through the yard, all of it was part of a pedagogy of pain that reinforced the master's control. Each punishment was not just an individual penalty, but a collective warning. Any attempt at resistance would be crushed. The Casa-Grande, in this sense, functioned as both stage and backstage of violence, and we cannot forget the role of the white mistresses in this context. They were often both accomplices and victims of a cruel logic. Sitting on their verandas, they watched the submission of enslaved women with a mixture of jealousy, contempt, and power. Some took out their frustrations in physical punishments and humiliations, delivering cruel words and inhumane orders. Others remained silent, sustaining through omission the machinery of oppression. In practice, the Casa-Grande became a space where violence perpetuated itself in multiple forms, from complicit silence to direct aggression. The enslaved, in turn, knew that every corner of the plantation was regulated by the presence of the Casa-Grande. It was there that decisions were made about who would go to the whipping post, who would be sold, who would receive a rare concession, or who would be branded with a hot iron. The corridors echoed with footsteps that dictated destinies, and the reinforced gates prevented anyone from daring to forget their place. The Casa-Grande was therefore more than a home. It was a barracks of surveillance, a court of injustice, and often a disguised prison. And it is precisely at this point that our reflection deepens. The Casa-Grande, seen by many as a symbol of tradition and cultural heritage, in fact carried the character of imprisonment. Its rooms were not just spaces of coexistence, but of confinement. Its corridors were not merely passageways, but paths of pain. Its doors did not open to welcome, but to silence. To fully understand how the Casa-Grande became a prison, we must look beyond its facades and ballrooms. We need to step into the closed chambers, the dark rooms, and the basements that are rarely mentioned, because it is there, in what is absent from the official books, that we find the truth about the fate of enslaved women whose lives were shaped by the invisible prison of oppression, and it is precisely this descent that we will take next. If until now we have seen the Casa-Grande as a symbol of power and surveillance, in the next chapter we will reveal how its rooms became silent prisons, where enslaved women were stripped of dignity, freedom, and even the right to exist as human beings. When we think of a prison, the first image that comes to mind is one of bars, dark cells, and armed guards. However, for enslaved women, prison took on a much more subtle and silent form. The Casa-Grande, which many viewed as a symbol of prestige and power, functioned as a true invisible jail. There, iron or high walls were unnecessary to maintain control. All it took was the logic of fear, the weight of authority, and the certainty of punishment. The wide corridors, lit by torches or candles, were in reality trails of submission. Every step taken by an enslaved woman inside the Casa-Grande was watched by the vigilant eyes of the overseer or the constant presence of the plantation master. The heavy doors that shut behind them sounded like the locks of a cell. The silence that dominated the environment was not a sign of peace, but of coercion. Every gesture was controlled, every word measured, every movement monitored. The bedrooms, seemingly spaces of rest, turned into environments of imprisonment. Some enslaved women were forced to sleep in small rooms near the kitchen or the master's quarters, always available for service or for the master's desires. There was no possible escape. The constant proximity to the plantation master turned routine into permanent surveillance. Fear was as real as the iron shackles that bound the men in the senzala. The basements and storage rooms of the Casa-Grande also served as prisons. Often, women who resisted or refused to obey were locked in dark, damp spaces where they spent hours or even days as exemplary punishment. The whipping post and the pillory stood outside, visible to all. But inside the Casa-Grande, there were hidden punishments carried out away from the community's eyes, reinforcing the nature of that space as a secret prison. The overseer, the armed hand of power, moved between the senzala and the Casa-Grande like a relentless guard. He did not need chains to control enslaved women. The threatening stare, the whip hanging from his hand, and the certainty that any disobedience would be punished with severity were enough. It was as if every corner of the Casa-Grande were an extension of the pillory, where torment always lurked. The prison was not only physical, it was also psychological. The constant fear, the lack of options, and the absence of freedom made the mind itself a cell. Enslaved women knew they were always at the mercy of the master's will, and that no cry for help would ever be heard. Silence was the only way to survive, and over the years, that silence turned into an invisible chain. The Casa-Grande thus functioned as a prison without bars, but with walls of power. The luxury that impressed visitors was only a facade. Behind the painted walls and silk curtains hid the cruelest side of slavery. There, enslaved women were treated as property, forced to serve in silence, deprived of the right to say no, and constantly subjected to humiliation. The environment was carefully organized to reinforce this hierarchy. Interior doors were rarely opened without permission, and the simple act of crossing a hallway could mean submission or punishment. Every room, every space in the Casa-Grande had a function of control. The ballroom, where the local elite gathered, displayed wealth accumulated through the sweat and blood of the senzala. Meanwhile, the bedrooms hid secrets never revealed in public, but which left deep scars on enslaved women. This invisible prison was also sustained through isolation. Inside the Casa-Grande, many women were separated from their companions in the senzala, deprived of the collective support that could bring them some comfort. There, surrounded only by oppressors, their vulnerability grew. Loneliness was as cruel a weapon as the whip. Each night spent in the Casa-Grande was another chapter of fear, pain, and helplessness. It is important to remember that the Casa-Grande prison was not an accident, but part of a carefully maintained system. The plantation master knew that control required not only physical force, but also psychological manipulation. The Casa-Grande, in this sense, was both a symbol of power and an instrument of oppression. It was a prison disguised as a home, one that robbed enslaved women of any possibility of freedom. Thus, when we look at these colonial mansions preserved as historical heritage, we must see beyond their imposing architecture. Every stone, every wall, every door bears the marks of those who lived imprisoned there without ever having committed a crime. The memory of the enslaved women who suffered inside the Casa-Grande must be recovered so that we do not fall into the illusion of romanticizing the past. And if until now we have understood how the Casa-Grande functioned as a prison, in the next chapter, we will dive even deeper. We will reveal the horrors of the so-called forbidden room, where sexual violence became routine and the torment of the night scarred entire generations of enslaved women. Inside the Casa-Grande, there was a space rarely mentioned, even among the masters and mistresses themselves, the so-called forbidden room. It did not earn that name by chance. It was there that one of the most brutal and inhumane practices of the slave system took place: sexual violence against enslaved women. While the whipping post and pillory displayed physical violence for all to see, this room hid intimate violence, carried out in darkness and sustained by silence. The torment of the night began silently, yet terrifyingly. The door of the senzala would slowly creak open, and the overseer, or even the plantation master himself, would call one of the women by name. The path between the senzala and the Casa-Grande, lit by torches and marked by the sounds of nocturnal insects, became the road of humiliation. Each step was accompanied by silent gazes. Companions praying quietly, men weeping in despair, and children learning far too soon what it meant to live under oppression. Inside the Casa-Grande, the corridors that by day displayed luxury and ostentation turned at night into hallways of fear. The sound of sandals on stone floors, the creaking of heavy doors, and the quickened breath of the women formed a symphony of terror. Upon reaching the forbidden room, the enslaved woman knew there was no escape. The tall walls and thick curtains muffled the screams. There, the plantation master exercised what he considered his right of ownership, to use a woman's body as an extension of his possession of the plantation. Sexual violence was not an isolated or occasional act. It was a systematic practice, repeated night after night. Plantation masters viewed these women as part of their assets, comparable to furniture, land, or animals. There were no limits, not even a minimum age. Many adolescents, still in their growth years, were chosen, carrying forever the physical and psychological scars of premature violence. The torment of the night did not end at dawn. Its consequences stretched across a lifetime. The impacts of this practice were devastating. Women who became pregnant carried a double sentence. Beyond the trauma, they saw their children born without rights, considered enslaved from the womb. Many times these children were rejected by the white mistresses, who saw in them the living proof of their husband's betrayal. The Casa-Grande became a stage for silent disputes, where enslaved women suffered both at the hands of the master and at the hands of the mistress, targeted by jealousy and cruel revenge. The violence also had immediate physical consequences. Forced abortions, sexually transmitted diseases, and infections were common. Without any medical care or rest, women were still forced to continue heavy labor in the mills, kitchens, and senzalas. Their bodies, already scarred by whips and shackles, were also wounded within, carrying invisible scars that history rarely acknowledges. Psychologically, the prison of the Forbidden Room left even deeper marks. Constant fear turned life into permanent vigilance. There was never certainty about who would be called next, creating an atmosphere of collective terror. Silence was imposed not only by the master, but also by the enslaved community itself, which, powerless, avoided speaking of it. That silence, repeated through generations, turned into a collective trauma, passed from mothers to daughters as an inheritance of pain. But it is important to highlight that even in the face of such brutality, there was resistance. Some women sought ways to escape this torment, even through small gestures. Some mutilated themselves so as not to attract the master's attention. Others attempted to poison him in desperate acts of vengeance. There were also those who united to protect the youngest, hiding them when danger was sensed. These acts, even when punished with cruel torture at the whipping post or pillory, were signs that the flame of resistance never went out. The Forbidden Room, therefore, was not only a physical space. It was a symbol of the invisible prison that the Casa-Grande represented. There concentrated the darkest side of slavery, the one that rarely appears in history books or in guided tours of colonial mansions, preserved as cultural heritage. The memory of this space must be reclaimed because it symbolizes not only a distant past, but also helps us understand the deep roots of gender violence and structural racism that persist to this day. When we visit a Casa-Grande today, We often admire the architecture, the well-preserved walls, the colonial furniture and the ballrooms. But how many stop to ask themselves what happened behind closed doors? How many recognize that beyond the luxury, those walls hold the echo of the suffocated screams of enslaved women? The forbidden room cannot be erased from history. It is a painful reminder that oppression does not always show itself in the public square. Sometimes it hides in the most intimate spaces, disguised as normality. Understanding the torment of the night and the systematic violence against enslaved women is essential if we are to understand the invisible chains that still imprison so many black women today. The objectification of their bodies, social marginalization, and gender violence all have deep roots in this past. Recognizing this is the first step to breaking the cycle. However, this violence could not have been sustained for so long without the complicity of silence. Inside the Casa-Grande, there were other women, the white mistresses, wives of the plantation masters, who often witnessed or at least suspected what was happening. Their reactions ranged from omission to vengeful jealousy to direct violence against the enslaved women, but rarely was there a gesture of solidarity. On the contrary, the maintenance of this cruel system depended largely on collective normalization. And it is precisely about this silence, this complicity, and this cycle of pain that we will reflect in the next chapter. Because to understand the full extent of the prison that the Casa-Grande represented, we must also analyze the role of the society that sustained, accepted, and reproduced this brutal logic. No system of oppression is sustained solely by the strength of one man. The machinery of slavery, and in particular the invisible prison of the Casa-Grande, depended on a web of silences, omissions, and complicities. The violence that took place inside the forbidden rooms and in the dark corridors could not have lasted for centuries if there had not been those who accepted, those who kept quiet, and those who, in some way, legitimized those practices. The white mistresses played a central role in this dynamic. Often, they were the ones who managed the Casa-Grande on a daily basis, controlling the routines of the enslaved women in the kitchen, in domestic labor, and in childcare. They knew better than anyone what happened between their husbands and the women from the senzala. Some chose to pretend not to see. Others, consumed by jealousy, unleashed their anger directly on the enslaved women, inflicting humiliating punishments, burns, beatings, and deprivations. It was easier to punish the victim than to confront the power of the plantation master. This female silence within the Casa-Grande had deep roots. The white mistress herself lived under her husband's dominance, limited in her choices and with no room to question the patriarch's decisions. At the same time, she enjoyed the privileges of slavery, washed clothes, prepared meals, cared for children. Thus, violence against the enslaved became part of a routine that was accepted and even defended because it sustained the structure that ensured her comfort. Complicity, however, did not come only from elite women. Colonial society as a whole fueled this silence. Priests, neighbors, and visitors rarely denounced the abuses. Many considered the acts of the plantation master a natural right of those who owned land and enslaved people. The black woman's body was seen as property, and sexual violence was normalized as an extension of that ownership. In church sermons, one spoke of morality, sin, and family, but almost never of the torment of the night. The pulpit served more to reinforce hierarchies than to denounce injustices. This pact of silence was also maintained through economics. The mills depended on productivity, and any scandal could compromise business, political alliances, and social prestige. It was more convenient to ignore the suffering of enslaved women than to risk the system that filled the coffers of the colonial elite. Thus, the Casa-Grande remained untouchable, shielded by collective indifference. For the enslaved women themselves, Silence became a survival strategy. To denounce or resist openly meant risking even crueler punishments at the whipping post or pillory. Many times, women shared only glances, tears, or whispered prayers at night when they believed no one was listening. This silence was not consent, but the only possible way to endure and, in some cases, to protect the younger ones. At the same time, there were moments when this silence was broken. Stories of collective escapes, of women who united to confront the master, or who found refuge in quilombos, show that not all accepted the prison imposed by the Casa-Grande. But each act of resistance was quickly crushed by the brutality of the system. The flames of rebellion were smothered by the overseer's whip, iron shackles, and the constant threat of family separation. Silent complicity also manifested itself in cultural transmission. Poems, letters, and accounts written by foreign travelers sometimes hinted at the existence of this violence, but rarely denounced it clearly. Literature of the time preferred to romanticize life on the plantations, describing the Casa-Grande as a symbol of hospitality, without mentioning the crimes that took place behind its doors. Official history, written by the victors, chose to erase the voices of the enslaved women. This erasure was not accidental. It was a conscious choice by a society that preferred to preserve the image of the plantation masters' grandeur rather than face the reality of their cruelty. And the price of that silence was paid in blood, tears, and generations of women reduced to the role of guiltless prisoners. Today, when we revisit this past, it's impossible not to notice how that silence echoes into the present. Many forms of gender violence continue to be made invisible, naturalized, or justified. The black woman's body in particular still faces stigmas and prejudices rooted in that era. Recognizing historical complicity is a necessary step to break the invisible chains that still persist. If the Casa-Grande was the center of power, it was also the center of a mission. The silence of the mistresses, the connivance of priests, society's indifference, and the enslaved people's fear created the perfect environment for violence to flourish unchallenged. And it was in this context of collective omission that another cruel aspect of the prison emerged: the cycle of pain passed from mothers to daughters, from generation to generation, within the senzalas and the Casa-Grande itself. It is precisely this cycle, marked by separations, humiliations, and children born of violence, that will be the focus of the next chapter. Because understanding how pain was inherited is essential to grasp the depth of the scars slavery left on our history. The invisible prison of the Casa-Grande did not end with direct violence. It extended into the lives that were born from that context, creating a cycle of pain that crossed generations. Many enslaved women became pregnant as a result of the torment of the night, and their children came into the world already marked by the stigma of slavery. The law was cruel. Any child born of an enslaved woman's womb was automatically considered enslaved, regardless of the father's identity. Thus, even when the plantation master was responsible for the pregnancy, the child had no rights, inherited no name, and received no recognition. These mothers watched their children grow up without protection, subjected to the very system that violated them. Many were forced to return to fieldwork just days after giving birth, leaving newborns in the care of other women in the senzala. Breastfeeding, affection, and maternal bonding were constantly interrupted by the logic of production. The body of the enslaved woman was viewed as a double machine, capable of generating labor power and, at the same time, multiplying the number of enslaved people on the estate. The fate of daughters was even more cruel. From an early age, girls learned the weight of silence. They watched their mothers being summoned at night, heard muffled cries, and carried the fear that one day they would be chosen to follow the same path. Many adolescents, still unable to fully grasp the scope of what was happening, fell victim to the forbidden room. The cycle repeated itself mercilessly. Mothers prayed that their daughters would escape, but rarely could they prevent the torment from reaching them as well. This cycle of pain was not limited to sexual violence. Family separation was constant. Children were sold like merchandise to other plantations, often at a very young age, torn from their mother's arms. Desperate cries echoed through the senzalas, but nothing could stop the trade. Enslaved women suffered the double pain of losing their children to the market and knowing they would never see them again. Each sale was a sentence of silence and mourning. The white mistresses, in many cases, reinforced this cycle. Some imposed punishments on mixed-race children, whom they saw as unwanted rivals. Others ordered them kept away from the Casa-Grande to avoid exposing their husband's betrayal. These children born of violence grew up rejected, not accepted among whites, yet burdened by the slavery imposed on them from birth. There was also the psychological weight. Mothers bore the guilt of being unable to protect their children. Many suffered in silence, crying at night in the senzala, asking the Orixas or the Christian God for strength to endure the loss. Some turned to protective rituals, songs, and prayers passed down through generations, trying in some way to break the invisible chains that imprisoned their families. Motherhood, in this context, was an act of resistance, but also one of permanent pain. The repetition of the cycle carved deep marks into the identity of enslaved communities. Girls who saw their mothers suffer already knew what awaited them. Boys who witnessed the abuses grew up with the pain of being unable to defend their mothers or sisters, since any attempt at resistance would result in brutal punishment at the whipping post or even death. Silence, therefore, was taught from an early age as a tool for survival. Yet even within this bleak scenario, there were glimmers of hope. Some mothers, realizing their daughters were in imminent danger, tried to flee with them to quilombos, risking their own lives in search of freedom. Others taught girls small acts of resistance, how to hide, how to pray, how to find strength in one another's gaze. These teachings did not completely break the cycle, but they planted seeds that would later sprout into acts of courage. The cycle of pain in the Casa-Grande was therefore not merely individual. It became collective, marking entire families and shaping the fate of communities. With each daughter violated, each son sold, each mother humiliated, a memory of suffering was built that still echoes today. This legacy helps explain, in part, the inequalities that persist to this day, because pain does not disappear. It becomes cultural inheritance, transmitted from generation to generation, and it is precisely at this point that we must pause to reflect. If up to now we have seen the weight of pain and powerlessness, the next chapter will show the other side of this story: resistance. Because despite the entire cycle of suffering, enslaved women were not only victims, they were also protagonists of acts of courage that defied the logic of the Casa-Grande. It is this flame of female resistance that we will discuss next. In the face of the daily violence of the Casa-Grande, it might seem that enslaved women were merely passive victims of a relentless system. But history shows us another reality. They were also protagonists of a silent resistance, often invisible to the master's eyes, yet powerful enough to keep the flame of dignity alive. With each act of refusal, each protective gesture, each risky escape, a seed of rebellion was sown that challenged the invisible prison of slavery. Resistance began in the details. Some women refused to accept motherhood imposed by violence. Many resorted to rudimentary methods of abortion, risking their own lives to prevent a child from being born marked by slavery. This act, seen by many as desperation, was in fact an extreme form of resistance, a silent no to the continuation of the cycle of pain. Others hid their teenage daughters, trying to protect them from the torment of the night, even knowing they could be severely punished if discovered. There were also subtler forms of resistance. Some women feigned illness to avoid nighttime summons. Others used herbs and knowledge brought from Africa to try to protect themselves or weaken the master. Small poisonings, secret preparations, and spiritual rituals functioned as invisible weapons. It was not uncommon for masters to fall mysteriously ill, never suspecting that their frailty might be the fruit of the ancestral wisdom of the women they exploited. Music and religiosity also became trenches of resistance. Songs sung in the senzala, often in African languages, carried messages of hope and courage. Rituals of faith were practiced in secret, strengthening community bonds and conveying the idea that slavery could not imprison the soul. Inside the Casa-Grande, even a song murmured while cooking could be an act of resistance because it kept alive the cultural roots the masters tried to erase. And there was, of course, direct resistance. Many women risked everything to flee. Some found refuge and freedom in quilombos, stories of mothers who escaped with small children facing dark nights and dense forests, revealed the courage of those who preferred to risk their lives rather than remain under the Casa-Grande's yoke. In the quilombos, these women were not only survivors, but leaders. They often organized community life, passed on knowledge, and ensured the continuity of the fight against slavery. Zumbi dos Palmares and other Quilombo leaders are remembered as symbols of collective resistance, but it is important to emphasize that without the strength of women, these spaces of freedom would not have endured so long. They planted, cooked, cared for children, but they also took up arms when necessary. Female resistance, therefore, was not limited to the home. It was present on the battlefield, in everyday life, and in spirituality. Even those who never managed to flee found ways to challenge the system. Some refused to betray companions, even under torture. Others sabotaged production, breaking tools, delaying tasks, or feigning ignorance. These acts, seemingly small, had a great impact on the slave system because they undermined its efficiency and showed that despite the domination, there was never total submission. It is important to understand that every act of female resistance carried immense weight. A woman who refused to obey risked being punished at the whipping post, beaten until she bled, or even killed. Still, many chose to resist, showing that dignity could be preserved even in the midst of pain. This courage not only defied the masters, but also inspired other enslaved women to keep the flame of hope alive. Resistance also manifested in motherhood. Many women, even without being able to fully protect their children, passed on values of courage, faith, and solidarity. They taught them to pray, to sing, to believe in freedom. Some told stories of free ancestors, feeding children's imaginations with the idea that another future was possible. This act of educating through resistance was a powerful weapon against forgetting. These feminine strategies revealed that, even imprisoned within the Casa-Grande, enslaved women were never just victims. They were warriors who faced the most dangerous enemy: silence. They broke invisible barriers, defied expectations, and created forms of struggle that did not depend only on physical strength, but on cunning, courage, and spirituality. Today, when we revisit the history of slavery, it is essential to rescue these narratives of female resistance, because the memory of slavery cannot be only a recollection of pain, but also the recognition of the strength of those who refuse to be destroyed. These women are a fundamental part of the legacy of struggle that has reached us. And if resistance was able to keep the flame of freedom alive, even in the dark corridors of the Casa-Grande, in the next chapter we will see how this memory survived through time. Because more than pain and resistance, the story of these women left a powerful legacy that still challenges us today to reflect on racism, inequality, and the need to keep alive the memory of those who suffered and fought. The history of the Casa-Grande as a prison for enslaved women did not end with abolition. Its marks cross time and still echo today in the social, cultural, and psychological structures of our society. The silence that for centuries muffled the screams of enslaved women remains present, now in the form of structural racism, gender inequality, and social exclusion. The past has not disappeared. It has transformed into invisible chains that still imprison many black women today. Visiting an old Casa-Grande preserved as historical heritage can have a profound impact. The carefully restored walls hide stories that are rarely told. Guides speak of architecture, colonial furniture, and the elite's lifestyle, but often fail to mention the torments of the night, the forbidden room, and the pain of enslaved women. This omission perpetuates a legacy of invisibility, as if the violence had never existed. Rescuing the memory of these women is essential to give voice to those who were silenced. Memory, however, does not live only in stone walls. It survives in songs, rituals, dances, and narratives passed down from generation to generation. Many Afro-Brazilian cultural traditions carry symbols of resistance created by women who, even in the prison of the Casa-Grande, found ways to maintain their identity. The drum, the chant, and faith became weapons against forgetting. This cultural heritage is a legacy of strength that must be valued and recognized. But we cannot ignore the weight of trauma. The cycle of pain, passed from mothers to daughters, still manifests today in the form of social exclusion, domestic violence, and inequality in access to rights. Black women continue to be those who suffer most from poverty, violence, and lack of opportunities. This reality is no coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the structure built during slavery. The black woman's body, treated as merchandise in the Casa-Grande, still faces stigmas that hinder its full recognition as a subject of rights. Structural racism is one of the greatest legacies of this history. It manifests in the way society sees or ignores the pain of the black population. Just as silence sustained violence in the Casa-Grande, today social silence often perpetuates injustices. The absence of representation, denial of opportunities, and normalization of police violence are echoes of a past that insists on repeating itself. Breaking this cycle requires remembering, recognizing, and naming the violences that official history tried to erase. Another fundamental aspect of the legacy is resistance. If enslaved women found ways to resist even within the invisible prison, their descendants continue this struggle today. The fight for equality, representation, and justice is the continuation of that flame of resistance. Black women who now occupy positions of power, lead social movements, or keep alive the cultural traditions of their ancestors are proof that the pain was not in vain. Preserving memory, therefore, is a political act. Telling the true story of the Casa-Grande is not only an academic or cultural matter, but a form of justice. Every time we mention the forbidden room, the torment of the night, or the invisible chains, we are breaking centuries of silence. We are saying that those women were not just victims, but also protagonists of a history of resistance. This recovery of memory also has a direct impact on building a more just future. By recognizing that gender violence and racism have historical roots, we can better understand current challenges and seek deeper solutions. It is not enough to fight only the symptoms. It is necessary to confront the structural causes, and this is only possible when we look back without fear, acknowledging the pain, but also celebrating the strength of those who survived. The memory of the Casa-Grande challenges us to reflect on our own attitudes. How many times do we remain silent in the face of today's injustices? How many times do we accept as normal practices that perpetuate inequality? The silence that sustained the imprisonment of enslaved women is the same silence that today may sustain other forms of oppression. Breaking this cycle requires courage, awareness, and action. If up to now we have walked the dark corridors of the Casa-Grande, revealing its invisible prisons and hidden violences, it is time to take a step further. Because history does not end only in denunciation or remembrance. It needs a conclusion that provokes us to act, to transform memory into awareness, and awareness into change. In the next chapter, we will bring together everything exposed so far. We will reflect on how the Casa-Grande, both a symbol of power and of prison, still teaches us about the dangers of silence and omission. And more than that, we will trace a path of hope, showing that remembering is also a way of liberating. The Casa-Grande, so often romanticized as a symbol of tradition and colonial wealth, reveals itself, when we look honestly, as a space of pain, silence, and imprisonment. Throughout this narrative, we have seen that its thick walls and wide corridors were not merely architectural features, but instruments of control. Every room, every basement, and every closed door held the stories of enslaved women who were subjected to humiliations that cannot be erased. These women lived within an invisible prison, where the torment of the night, the forbidden room, and complicit silence formed the perfect machinery to sustain violence. Their bodies were used as instruments of power, their voices silenced, and their tears hidden by collective indifference. The Casa-Grande, which from the outside appeared luxurious and imposing, was inside a scene of emotional, physical, and spiritual prisons. But the story we recover here is not only about pain, it is also about resistance. With each woman who dared to say no, with each mother who risked her life to protect her daughter, with each escape toward a Quilombo, we find a testimony of courage. These women were not only victims of the slave system, they were also silent warriors whose resistance, even if discreet, kept the flame of freedom alive. The cycle of pain that crossed generations also shows us how slavery left deep marks on society. Children born of violence were rejected, families were torn apart, and collective trauma was perpetuated. Even today, we see reflections of that past in the marginalization of black women, who continue to be the most affected by inequality, violence, and structural racism. The prison of the Casa-Grande transformed into invisible chains that in different forms still imprison. That is why memory is so important. Telling the true story of the Casa-Grande is not just an academic exercise, it is an act of justice. It is giving voice to those who were silenced, shedding light on what was hidden, breaking the pact of silence that sustained centuries of violence. Every time we remember these stories, every time we mention the torment of the night or the forbidden room, we are saying that those women will not be forgotten. But remembering is not enough. Memory must be transformed into awareness, and awareness into action. The silence that sustained the prison of the enslaved can still be seen today when society ignores the pain of black women, when gender violence is normalized, or when racism is treated as a minor detail. Breaking with this requires courage to denounce, to educate, to transform. And here is an invitation to you who have followed us to this point. If the story of the Casa-Grande teaches us anything, it is that silence is complicit in oppression. Breaking silence is everyone's responsibility. Every time you share this knowledge, every time you give voice to these memories, you help break the invisible chains that still remain. Abolition, celebrated in 1888, did not completely end slavery. What changed was its form, but many structures of exclusion remained. That is why understanding the past is key to transforming the present. The legacy of female resistance, so often erased, must be celebrated as inspiration. These women showed that even in the midst of pain, it is possible to fight, and that dignity can survive even the greatest cruelties. The conclusion we draw is clear. The Casa-Grande was a prison, but also a stage for resistance. It was a symbol of oppression, but also a witness to courage. It was a scene of pain, but also a source of lessons that we still need to learn today. And the greatest of these lessons is that silence must never be an option in the face of injustice. That is why, as we close this journey, I leave you with a call. Let us be heirs not of silence, but of courage. Let us learn from the pain of the past to build a future in which no woman is treated as property, in which no voice is silenced, and in which no invisible chain continues to imprison lives. If this story touched you, share it. Help more people discover the truth hidden behind the walls of the Casa-Grande. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and keep this memory alive. Because to remember is to resist, and to resist is to transform. And just like those women who, even while imprisoned, found ways to fight, we too can break the invisible walls that still surround us. The past cannot be changed, but the future is in our hands. May the silenced voices of the Casa-Grande echo within us as a cry of freedom, so that the prison that was once normalized will never be repeated.